Hello everybody, good afternoon and welcome to our webinar today on volunteering and the law, what you need to consider when engaging with volunteers. My name is Claire Ahrens, I'm a training coordinator here at NCVO. I'm joined today by Jarina Chowdhury, who is the Volunteering Development Consultant here at NCVO, and Lauren and Debbie, who are our webinar organisers. So what's going to happen? For the next 30 minutes, Jarina's going to present. And after that, we'll be having 15 minutes of question and answers. Now, we've been inundated with advanced questions. So what we've done is consolidated them, and we're going to try and answer as many as we can during the presentation, and we'll be having a couple of questions at the end. A lot of these questions will also be answered on our training course, which happens on the 1st of February next year. At the end of the webinar, you'll be asked to complete a short follow-up survey. So, what are we going to cover today? What are the aims of the webinar? So, by the end of the webinar, you will have explored what you need to be aware of when working with volunteers. You will understand key legislation and how it relates to volunteering, and you'll identify possible actions to reduce this risk. The caveat to all of this is that this isn't a substitute for legal advice. If you have got something complex or you're not sure about, then please do seek professional legal advice. I'm going to hand you over now to Jarina.
Hello, and today we're going to look at 10 aspects of volunteering in the law, and these are the areas that we're going to look at. So before we begin, it's quite useful to ask you, do you think that volunteers have a legal status? So we're just going to do a quick poll with you, and we'd just like you to ask, like you to tell us yes or no, whether or not you think volunteers have a legal status. And the rest of this presentation will address the status of volunteers in relation to their legal status. But it's always interesting to ask what people think regarding that, and then to see whether or not their practices actually reflect their convictions. So I'm just going to look at the results now. Very interesting. 71% of you think that volunteers have a legal status, 16% think no, and 13% are not sure. That's fantastic, you're all in the right place. Before we actually look at that then, I think it's useful also just to remind ourselves of how we define volunteering. Many of you will be familiar with this definition. I'm not going to read it out. I'm sure that you're familiar with it. It's NCVO's definition, and it's the adopted definition in England. So underpinning this then are some characteristics, which are that volunteering is something that is a choice that is freely made. Volunteering is voluntary and can include formal activity undertaken through public, private and voluntary organisations, as well as informal community participation. So now let's look then at the legal status of volunteers. So in UK law, volunteers do not have a legal status. So 71% of you that thought that they do, I think you need to stay with us to the end of this webinar. They're not mentioned in any legislation at all. Unlike paid staff, they are not covered by employment law. They do not have legal protection from unfair dismissal, and they are not covered by equal opportunities legislation. So later, we're going to look at legislation that impacts on volunteers and why, in terms of good practice, it's best to include volunteers, although you are not legally obliged to do so. So here are some points for you to keep in mind then. There is no legal definition of a volunteer. Volunteers are not covered by employment law or included in national minimum wage legislation. What a role is called doesn't necessarily have any relation to the legal status of the role. Just because you call a volunteer, that doesn't determine its legal status. So for example, if you give someone the role of volunteer campaigner, but treat them as though they are working under contract, then the name volunteer in their role may not bear any relation to their legal status. So what you also need to be aware of is that through your language and behaviour, you may unintentionally create an employment contract with your volunteers. And a contract is a description of a relationship. It can be entirely verbal. In other words, a contract can exist without paper or signing of a document, and it does not have to be written down. So when engaging volunteers, it's good practice to treat them fairly and to include them so they feel valued, treated well, and part of your team, project, or organisation. So we're now going to look at what you can do to reduce the risk of creating a contract. Let's begin by saying you cannot eliminate risk completely, but there are things you can do to reduce risk. So don't create obligations, adopt flexible language, and keep arrangements under review with your volunteers. Don't use words that create a sense of a binding agreement. Penalties or language that imply penalties should be avoided. Only reimburse out-of-pocket expenditure related to volunteering activity. Only provide training that is clearly and directly relevant to the volunteer's role. Written documents should avoid creating expectations or requirements for time commitments or anything that might be perceived as a formal or contractual relationship. These are some really good ways in which you can reduce the risk of creating an employment contract. We're just going to look briefly now at volunteer expenditure. So you should pay out-of-pocket expenses, volunteer-related expenditure, for example, travel, food, childcare, protective clothing and equipment. In short, any expenditure that is incurred as a direct result of a person volunteering. It is good practice to cover volunteer-related expenses because by not paying travel expenses, for example, you could be presenting a real barrier and exclude people from volunteering. Make sure as well that you have a clear volunteer claims process based on evidence of expenditure. Now we're going to look at reward and recognition, and we've got another poll for you. So we'd like you to think about how volunteers can be recognised and appreciated for their efforts, and we're going to do the poll so you can tell us what you think about rewarding volunteers. So you can choose one of these three answers. One is, I don't reward volunteers because I don't want to single anyone out. Number two is I reward volunteers with small gestures, for example, flowers or boxes of chocolates. And number three is I reward my volunteers regularly or when the mood takes me. So we're just going to look at the poll results now. Very interesting poll results. I don't reward them. I don't want to single anyone out, 26%. I reward them with small gestures, flowers or chocolates, 39%. I reward my volunteers regularly or when the mood takes me, 36%. We're going to look at that now. So, it is okay to give modest gifts to volunteers, such as flowers and chocolates, when they leave or after many years of service, or to acknowledge outstanding contribution. But avoid giving gifts to volunteers that create an expectation that they will be rewarded. Rewards should be proportionate to the contribution the volunteer has made to the organisation's total income, in terms of how much the organisation has done in relation to what your organisation's total income is. Rewards should be modest. And remember to only provide training relevant to the volunteer role. Also communicate very clearly to the volunteers why you're giving them this gift. And you might want to attach a thank you note with a clear reason as to why you're doing that. We're now going to look at equality and diversity. So the Equality and Diversity Act has 9 areas known as protected categories, and this includes race, age and disability, among others. Here's the list of all the 9. However, in January 2011, the Court of Appeal confirmed that the Equality Act does not apply to volunteers in the same way as employees, and ruled volunteers without contracts are not covered by anti-discrimination legislation for workers. So it's very important to bear that in mind. However, it's good practice to engage a diverse range of volunteers for lots of reasons, and here are just a few of them. So volunteers are not protected under the Act, but it just isn't acceptable to discriminate. And volunteering, as I'm sure you all know, plays a crucial role in bringing people of different backgrounds together, and embracing diversity is one way to do that through volunteering. Now we're going to look at data protection. The Data Protection Act regulates the use of personal data. It's all about requiring you to protect people's personal data, and it applies to all living people, and it's about how the data is protected rather than the status of the person the data emanates from. So it's all about personal data. It includes things like contact details from individuals that can be identified. It applies to information that you hold on computers, including databases, memory sticks, smartphones, and also in hard copy files, manual files. It does not apply to information collected where the source of the personal data is anonymous. So for example, if you surveyed me on the street and I was anonymous and I didn't give you any of my personal data, but you took my views about something, it wouldn't apply. But it does apply to personal data. So the reason that this is important in relation to volunteers is that volunteers who are exposed to and process other people's personal data, for example, the data of your service users or suppliers or other volunteers, they bear the same responsibilities in terms of acting in accordance with the Act. So regardless of whether a person is an employee or a volunteer, they must comply with the Data Protection Act. So some implications for volunteering then. You must train your volunteers in data protection, which may include how your organisation handles, processes and stores people's personal data. Don't forget that although there are no specific guidelines on volunteer records, volunteers also have the right to find out what personal information you hold about them. If you're storing data, you also have to keep it in line with other relevant legislation. So for example, with health and safety, accident reports have to be kept for 3 years. The Disclosure and Barring Service has its own specific guidelines about how to keep DBS records, so you need to cross-reference with the other legislation that applies. And if you want to know more about data protection, contact the Information Commissioner's Office. That's the official government website with lots of information there on guidance on how to maintain records. So some good practice then with data protection to help you. You should have a data protection policy, and this is what it should cover. These are 4 main points. Make your volunteers aware of the policy and enable them to implement the policy correctly. And don't forget number 4, mentioned here, that an individual, including volunteers, can access the information that you hold about them. Now we're going to look at health and safety. So the Health and Safety Act outlines the responsibilities that every employer has towards people who come under their care, or who may be affected by their activities. The Act does not mention volunteers. However, it's wise to include volunteers in regard to health, safety and well-being. An organisation or group with at least 1 employee who works under a contract of employment is considered to be an employer. So good practice then for health and safety. In English law, an individual may be owed a duty of care by another to ensure that they do not suffer any unreasonable harm or loss as a result of the latter's activity. So you can interpret this as I may be owed a duty of care by you so that I do not suffer any harm or loss as a result of your activity. So this means there are a number of steps you can take to improve health and safety for your volunteers as follows. You can identify risks and minimise them through carrying out risk assessments. You can have conversations with volunteers about risks. Always cover health and safety in volunteer inductions. Keep health and safety talked about. Ask volunteers to read your health and safety policy and to raise questions with you. Encourage volunteers to attend relevant or compulsory training to their role in relation to health and safety. And check your volunteers have at their disposal protective equipment and materials, and check the condition of this is monitored for wear and tear. It's good practice then to treat volunteers with equal consideration when it comes to health and safety. We're going to look at safeguarding now. So people aged 16 and above in a volunteering role that gives them access to children or adults in regulated activity may need to have a disclosure and borrowing service check prior to starting their role. So regulated activity is broken down into two separate groups. There are lists of activities, and we can signpost you to those lists. There are two main groups. There's activity with children, and there is also activity with adults. You may be more familiar with the term vulnerable adults. It's no longer called vulnerable adults. So regulated activity depends on what the activity is, its frequency, and where it's taking place. So what you need to do is you need to assess a volunteer role and identify whether the role is eligible for a DBS check. So before you request a DBS check, you must ask this question. It is unlawful to apply for a DBS check unless you have assessed that the role is eligible for one, and it's your responsibility to do that. And you must always explain to the volunteer why they are being DBS checked. Now we're going to look at insurance. We're going to look at insurance briefly for older volunteers. So for older volunteers, there's no upper age limit on volunteering, but some insurance policies will not cover people aged 80 or over, so check with your insurance provider. And do bear in mind that people's physical ability may change, so carry out appropriate risk assessments of roles and the abilities required to carry out those roles. And now we're going to look at younger volunteers. There is no legal reason why people under the age of 18 cannot volunteer. Children under 18 or under 16, if employed, are classed as a vulnerable group. You need to refer to the lower age limit on your insurance policies. I'm afraid that means that you do need to read your insurance policies. Children under the age of 14 are slightly different. They should not volunteer within school hours and are not legally allowed to volunteer for profit-making organisations or to carry out paid work. Just something for you to bear in mind. So good practice then, especially with younger volunteers. Please seek parental consent. Ensure appropriate adult supervision and attendance, and carry out risk assessments. Adopt appropriate child protection measures. Make sure you have a safeguarding policy and procedure in place. And now we're going to look at eligibility to volunteer. So, volunteers from outside the UK. Just to remind those of you that are not sure about this, people from the European Union and the European Economic Area can volunteer. Asylum seekers also can volunteer with registered charities, voluntary organisations and public sector organisations. And people who hold refugee status or who have exceptional leave to remain and their family members are also allowed to volunteer. Now, the Home Office operates a tiered volunteer system with very different categories within this, such as entrepreneur, spouse, dependent, visitor, student visa, lots of different visa category types. And some types of visas do carry restrictions. So guidance for non-UK nationals varies because it actually depends on the specifics outlined in their type of visa. So we've got some good practice tips for you then for volunteers from outside the UK. Please ask people to self-check their immigration status. Now you can establish the reason a person has come to the United Kingdom and record it as part of your recruitment process. Please note, you are not legally obliged to verify the immigration status of a volunteer. If you are gathering unnecessary personal information, for example, insisting on birth certificates and passports, you may be contravening the Data Protection Act. So in your discussion with potential volunteers, you'll probably establish one of these two categories. The person has come to the UK with the main intention of volunteering for a charitable organisation And if this is the case, that will have been the basis of their application to enter the United Kingdom. Or the person may have come to the United Kingdom for a different activity, such as employment, business, tourism, study, and volunteering is therefore not their primary reason for coming to the UK, but they want to volunteer as an additional activity. It's something they thought about doing after they came. So that, you know, in your recruitment discussion with them, you should try to ascertain that and ask them to verify their own status, immigration status. So anyone holding a visitor visa, as far as we're aware at the moment, is not allowed to take up paid or unpaid work during their stay in the United Kingdom. And from our current understanding of the rules relating to this type of visa, the visitor visa, unpaid work would actually include volunteering. So although organisations are free to take on any person for a genuine volunteering role, an individual could be in breach of their visa conditions if she or he volunteers when they are not permitted to. So as part of good practice in working with volunteers, it's sensible for you to tell potential volunteers to check their status with the Home Office as to whether or not they are allowed to volunteer. And just a word as well for you on something called illegal working, which you may be concerned about. So illegal working rules relate to employment and therefore should not apply to genuine volunteers who are not working under a contract of employment. However, there have been cases in which employment tribunals have found that a volunteer is actually an employee, which is why it is important to be clear about the legal status of your volunteers and make sure the culture of your organisation supports genuine volunteering to take place. We're going to look quickly now at what to do if things go wrong, and we've got one last poll for you. We'd like you to answer these questions. Where do you go if things go wrong? You've got a choice of 5. You can go to your volunteer centre or your council for voluntary service, or Citizens Advice Bureau or other law institution. A third option for you to choose is a conciliation service such as ACAS, or trade union, that's the 4th one we have, you can choose, or ombudsman, for example, the employment tribunal. So if you wouldn't mind just selecting one of those, and we can look at your poll results. Great, here they are. So, wonderful. Okay, quite a lot of you, 77% go to your volunteer centre or your CVS. 20% contact Citizens Advice Bureau or other law institution. 1% a conciliation service such as ACAS, and also 1% trade union. And none of you go to an ombudsman or employment tribunal. That's very encouraging to hear. Okay, so right, so as we know, not everyone has a happy or enriching volunteering experience. And I hope that if you manage volunteers well and in accordance with legislation that we have highlighted in this webinar, you'll develop a positive culture to support your volunteers and reduce the likelihood of misunderstanding or conflict. So NCVO led a volunteer rights inquiry in 2009 to 2011, which considered the role of legislation and found actually there was no appetite within the voluntary sector for an ombudsman or legislation to enforce volunteer rights. So actually there is no ombudsman, there is no mediation body to resolve conflict between volunteers if things go wrong. So we think that through dialogue with volunteering organisations, they've agreed that good practice could include adopting a simple problem-solving process to help raise and address issues early on, and a commitment from volunteering organisations to adopt good practice and ensure that you have up-to-date policies and good volunteer management, and ensure that concerns of volunteers are listened to and given due consideration, and that you offer reconciliation by having a well-communicated process that is understood by staff and volunteers, and accept responsibility for your volunteers and their well-being and respect their wish to talk things out if a conflict arises. So just some key principles for you here then: to assess the problem, make a change, provide time and opportunities to change, unless of course it's serious misconduct, Be firm and understanding and communicate during all stages. Also, please do remember that if the relationship has run its course, it's okay to part company with your volunteers, and of course best to do that on good terms rather than ill terms. So we've now got some questions. Got some questions that are sent in to us. So I've got a question here from Paula. Paula asked, do trustees of a charitable incorporated organisation that has a turnover of less than 50,000 per annum need to all be DBS checked? Well, it's got nothing to do with the type of organisation you are. It's got nothing to do with your annual turnover. It has to do with, think about what will the trustees be doing. Will they be involved in any activities that come under the regulated activity list, which we will send you? Will they be coming into contact with young people or older people, or people that used to be called vulnerable adults? And what kinds of activities will they be doing? Will they be unsupervised? So on that basis, you need to decide whether or not those roles as trustee roles should be DBS checked. Got another question here from Michelle. When engaging volunteers, is it a legal requirement to verify their visa status or eligibility to work in the UK, even though they will not be engaged as an employee? If you're offering a genuine volunteering opportunity, it's not your responsibility to check their right to work, because right to work, right to employment is a different thing entirely. Another question here from Emma. Can volunteer roles include cash handling? Yes, they can. It's up to you to have the right process in place. Volunteers do all kinds of things. There's nothing to say that volunteers present a risk if they're handling money. You just need to have the right, financial procedures in place, and a risk register, and support them and train them in the right way. Another question here. Got more. So is there a question here, is there a set of appropriate benefits to give to volunteers? For example, once you have reached 20 hours, you can get into properties for free. So really, it's up to you in terms of how you want to reward your volunteers. It really is up to you. It's down to the culture of your organisation. You just need to be clear that you're not presenting your volunteers with things that they might be able to sell on, things that present an economic value that they may be able to sell and make a profit from, because HMRC would be quite interested in that, and that they would regard that as income. And also not creating the expectation amongst your volunteers that they will be rewarded. There is a whole world around incentivised volunteering, which we can send you some information about, but it's really up to you to decide how you reward your volunteers. Have we got time for any more? Great. There's some quite specific questions around insurance. They are unfortunately very specific, and the best thing that I would advise you to do, as dull as it may seem, is to sit down and read your insurance policy. And I think that's probably the starting point, and then perhaps you could come back to NCVO if you're still unsure. So here's a question. I've also got, there's a question from Dennis about building a pathway in an organisation for beneficiaries to become volunteers, and volunteers potentially moving into paid roles. Is this okay? That is okay, because lots of people volunteer with the hope and with the intention of getting into paid work. You just have to make sure that in your volunteer management you're clear with them when they're volunteering, and that you're clear that they're not being rewarded through the promise or a possibility of paid work. There should be fair recruitment processes around employment. And that also applies to things like, equality and diversity legislation, when you're actually, which does apply to employees, and when you're seeking to recruit employees. So there is a grey area, but you just need to be clear in your own mind when are you supporting volunteers, and the roles that you have for your employees, and what you need to do in terms of legislation to support that. Any more? There's a question here from Liz Liz, I think your question is quite sophisticated, so I think this is actually a question that we all need to take to the Home Office. I would like to check, please, the info I've heard in relation to people visiting the UK being able to volunteer for up to 30 days in a registered charity relating to Home Office April 2015 changes to immigration rules. So a person apparently, it says a visitor may undertake incidental volunteering provided it lasts no more than 30 days in total and is for a charity that is registered in the UK. So I would say it would depend on the type of visa. There is such a thing as a visitor visa, but a person can have a visitor visa and it would depend on what it says in that visitor visa. My understanding is that visitor visas do not, well, I think it's too complicated to say. I think that's something that we would check with the Home Office on your behalf and get back to you. Do you have examples of a reward scheme that's set up with volunteers that safely reward volunteers based on longevity of performance, that is risk-free of employment assumptions? It's actually very difficult. There are probably lots of examples out there. I'm sure if we put a call out on Twitter, we get people coming forward with some examples. But actually, the risk of creating contracts unwittingly does increase with long-term volunteers, and that is just a natural outcome of people volunteering with you for a long time and settled relationships and patterns that get established. So I would say that maybe it's about, you could have the same person volunteering in your organisation for a long time, but perhaps they're, reporting to different people, doing different types of things. The volunteer management is such that they always have the opportunity to refuse tasks. They never have the sense of obligation that they need to be there. They can take it or leave it. But I mean, it's difficult with long-term volunteers because they do have a loyalty, and with that loyalty, other things are the loyalty sort of brings with it other things, and so it's not entirely risk-free. I'm afraid. You can't get away from, as I said earlier, you can't eliminate risk. You can do lots of things to reduce risk, but it may be that they think that the fact that they've employed with you, they volunteered with you for so long, on their part carries some employment type assumptions. You just keep it under review. You need to keep checking in with them. You need to keep the relationship quite light. Make sure you watch your language and that you're not making them feel that they need to be there, even though they may feel that they need to be there because they may need to volunteer with you more than you may actually need them to volunteer with you, if you see what I mean. Have we got time for any more? That's quite an interesting question. Can you reward volunteers with charitable funds? I would be wary about using, what do you term, because accountants, this is why we have accountants, what do you call charitable funds? I think that from an outsider's perspective, people might think that if you are spending money that they have helped to fundraise to pay for your volunteers, to take them to lunch or just to reward them or to say thank you, they may not look favourably upon that. They may not understand the complexities of volunteering involving organisations, and that actually it may be the first time ever that you've wanted to do that. So I would just be careful about how you phrase that. I mean, if it's organisation, it's unrestricted funding, and you can decide how you want to use it, or indeed even if if you're lucky enough to have a grant, and if as part of your grant conditions, your grant your grant maker doesn't mind if you support your volunteers by rewarding and recognising them, then that's no problem. But I would just be wary about it's your choice of language there. Somebody who doesn't understand the voluntary sector might pick up on that in quite a negative way. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't say thank you to your volunteers. This is again, okay, Sarah sent in a very specific question. Would a non-EU spouse of an EU citizen have a spouse's visa, and can they volunteer? If the role needed a DBS check, can this be done? That's a very technical question. I don't think I can answer that. And I would say it's probably case specific. If you've got a specific case, I would ask you to ask the person who wants to volunteer with you to contact the Home Office and see if they can get a response to their particular case. Right, this is a very interesting question here. Gavan has asked, should trustees of a charity that have no real contact with service users beside a celebration event? So I don't understand that question. Maybe you could rephrase that question. I'm not quite sure what the question is there. With regards to duty, Catherine, with regards to duty of care for volunteers, when would you advise asking a volunteer on their health and support needs to ensure you can support them effectively in their role? So with regards to duty of care for your volunteers, when would you advise asking a volunteer on health and support needs? I would do that when you're recruiting volunteers. I would, at the beginning of your recruitment process, ask them if they've got any specific needs around sort of health and safety, well-being. You know, it may be that they've got a learning disability and they're waiting for the right opportunity for you to ask them. They may not necessarily come forward and tell you that unless you provide the right context to ask. And I think at the point of recruitment is a good time to ask those questions. I also appreciate that, you know, you might not want to ask those questions early on. You might want to offer some taster sessions, and then you might want to reflect with your volunteers and ask them how they found it, and ask if they have any particular needs arising from that session, and if they thought that, you know, if they enjoyed it, if they thought that they could do better, and if so, what could you do to help them do better? And so Gavin's come back now. So should trustees of a charity that have no real contact with service users have a DBS check? I would say you need to look at what the trustee, this is very similar to the question that Paula asked and that I answered right at the beginning. It depends on what the trustees will be doing. Frequency and content, there are three elements. There's the nature of activities, so looking in that list of regulated activities and seeing whether or not what you're proposing to do matches any of those activities or is similar to those activities. And then there's the frequency of activities, and then there's is it supervised or unsupervised? And actually, there's also the other issue of whether it's supervised or unsupervised, and whether it's I've lost it on there. I've lost it on there. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it doesn't sound like it. Based on what you said, it doesn't sound like it. So DBS and Disclosure Scotland. DBS, Daniel, DBS and Disclosure Scotland are separate, and you actually need to contact Volunteer Scotland. And I do know that they ran a webinar on this a few months ago on DBS. They ran a webinar, so I suggest that you contact them because the law is different, and I can't comment, can only comment for England. Right, okay, so we have, Sarah says we have volunteer counsellors, and a condition of their volunteering is dependent on them completing an in-house course. Is that setting an obligation? It just depends on how you ask them to do this. If it's part of, if you phrase it as, you know, this will enhance your volunteering with us, this will make your volunteering experience, you know, this will enrich your volunteering experience, this will add to your professional development for later when you want to seek employment. So think about how you can pull out specifics to really make it clear of the relationship that you are having with them, which is not one which is under a contract. It's a voluntary relationship. They are free to come and go. However, you know, if they need to complete a minimum number of hours in order to provide counselling for you, it's just about how you ask them to do that. Asking rather than instructing is the way to get around that one. Have you got any more? Right, okay, this is a good one. Danita has asked, although volunteers do not have a legal status or obligation under employment law, if you have included an expectation of your volunteers to abide by your organisation's policies and procedures, is this legally binding for volunteers' responsibility to the organisation they volunteer for? That's a great question, Danita. Glad you asked it. Well, no, I mean, it depends, again, remember, it's all about your behaviours, the culture in the organisation, you know, how do you speak to your volunteers, do you bringing across a sense of obligation to them. It may be that you need, for example, you may need them to sign things to say that they have read your confidentiality policy, that they've attended health and safety. So you'll need to get them to sign things, and in a way you could say, well, you're asking them to abide by things. But what you're not doing is you're not obligating them to be there. You know, while they're with you, as part of volunteering with you, they need to understand that, you know, you may be working with vulnerable clients or young people, and they may need to understand all the sensitivities around that. So that's what you're asking them to do. You're not obligating them to be there under a contract. And also, you can just go back to that one, Claire, Danita's one. I think also some people, they don't have any hesitation over asking volunteers to sign things, and they don't worry about creating contracts, because remember, you can still create a contract, but verbally, you know, the piece of paper doesn't actually mean that much. Sorry, we'll go back to Danita's one again. This is a good one because lots of people contact NCVO about this, so I really want to make it clear. Some organisations, many organisations, ask volunteers to sign, and some have a disclaimer saying that this does not constitute a contract in any description, and then they go on to contradict themselves and treat their volunteers as though they're working under contract. So just be mindful. It's not good enough to you know, have these things written down and to have all the right wording, but then to have people in your organisation that are coordinating volunteers and supporting them, but obligating them to be there. So make sure that the behaviour the behaviour is such that it doesn't obligate the volunteers. So this is a good one from Liz. If you ask trustees to sit for a set number of years, is that implying a contract? I'm glad you asked that, Liz. Volunteers, trustees are volunteers, as I'm sure you know. I've never heard that one before. I don't think that you are implying a contract. I think it depend on how you ask them, you know, and does it depend on the context in which you're asking them. Perhaps if you're asking them in quite a kind of, you know, informal way, they might not feel that you're kind of implying a contract. They might feel quite flattered, actually. Perhaps they've done 3 years and they feel very flattered that you're asking them to you know, act as a trustee again for another 3 years. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. We do have a governance expert at NCVO. I could put your question to him, but I'm pretty sure that he'd come back and he'd say the same thing that I've said to you. Any others? That's quite a technical one. Do it. Yeah, we've done cash handling. So yeah, on the thing then, just to emphasise the volunteer agreements. You can have volunteer agreements. You can ask people to sign things. You can word it such so that they don't feel as if they are kind of signing a contract. It could just be something like, I agree to the organisation's mission. You know, I'm just signing up for that. So try not to worry too much about the anxieties of signed documents, because you can still have a contract without a piece of paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jarina. I hope you all enjoyed that. Tons of information to take on. This is being recorded, so we'll send you a link tomorrow so that you'll be able to access all this information. There's also a host of information on our NCVO website. We also host the National Volunteering Forum, and there's also a range of information about where to find your local volunteer centres. Thank you so much. There will be a chance to do a short feedback survey when you leave the webinar. You'll also see Jarina's details below. Please follow her on Twitter. And we have a training course on the 1st of February which is a whole day to explore more about this. Thank you for your time. I look forward to seeing you soon.